David Hunt in Anaheim, and I'm the proud owner of my 1956 P1900. There was 68 produced, and there is 4 that are running in the U.S. right now. The designer of the car was a man named Bill Tritt. He was the owner and designer for Glasspar boats in Costa Mesa, California. The Glasspar boats produced the first 4 prototype and the next 14 bodies, and then Volvo decided it cost too much to produce the bodies or pay for the bodies, so they decided to produce themselves, so the remainder they produced in Sweden. They didn't know quite how to work with fiberglass as far as hardware and hinges and that type of thing. The chassis were made, the first 4 were made in at Volvo, and the rest were contracted to, it was called Motorola Burkamp in Sweden. It was a modified PV445 chassis. I needed a car to go to school in, and so I went to a used car lot, and this was the cheapest car in the lot. It was $1,500, which was a lot of money in '56, and it was half the price of the original car, which was $3,000. And I just needed a car to go to school and back and forth. Didn't know anything about the car or the history or the uniqueness, and so I drove it for 8 years as a daily driver, and my brother drove it for another 8 years as a daily driver, and then it went into storage for about 10 years. I got it back out because my brother needed room to put more antiques, and so I decided to start restoring it. I started working on it very hard. All I had was a picture of the car of another Volvo, and that was it. No information, no other detail, pictures, nothing. And so I restored as much as I could, and then I limped it to a national event in Buena Park, National Volvo event, which was the hit of the show, because nobody had seen one in person at the show. And there was probably some, I don't know, 60, 80 cars entry. There was a president of the Volvo Club from Brazil there. There was the president of the Volvo Club of Canada there. So it was quite an event. I personally am friends with number 66 that resides in San Rafael, just above San Francisco, owned by Lars Jansson. And then I met another 1900 from New Mexico, Don Rideout, and we gathered in Arizona for the C70 debut, and our cars were on display there. They bought it in Arizona, and Don Rideout and his father restored it. And so that's 2 that I very familiar with. And then all the rest of the owners at the time, there was 6 other owners, and I've been in phone contact with all of them. One of them's in Portland, Maine. At the time, one was in Virginia, and another one was in Washington, and then the one in San Francisco. There's one that's not operable in by Magic Mountain, California, and then there's 2 more that aren't operational somewhere around Baldwin Park. And I've talked to all of them, but right now there's only 4 left that are running and 3 that are not running. And well, at least 6 are in Europe. 5 of them are in Holland, and 1 got sold from Holland to Russia recently. There's probably about 50 worldwide. So there's probably about 40 in Sweden that are in various states. I restored a 122, which right after I restored it, took it on its maiden voyage to Kansas City to a one-day Volvo meet. That was kind of exciting. No problems, ran like a champ. And then I've had a 240 work car that I had for over 15 years that just kept on running and running. It even got totaled and I still run it. The insurance company totaled it and I still turned around and drove it the next week into Arizona. Indestructible. That was a 84, affectionately known as a brick. The brick was because it was square and looked like a brick.
But these are pretty robust as well.
They're pretty tough car. It's got a very stiff frame. It's made out of double steel tube, 1.5 inch steel tube with the cross members that are 2 inch plus 1 in the center that's 5 inches in diameter. And then there's 1.5 inch diameter posts in front of and behind the doors. And the front one is connected to a stainless steel windshield, which would act as a roll bar. Very, very stiff. It's very well built. I have worked on it since I've owned it. The only other person that has worked on it until recently has been a master mechanic named Dolph DeBune, who was a master Volvo mechanic at Swedish Speed, and he passed away. And then this past year I had the engine and transmission, exhaust, suspension and other things done by Eric at High Performance in Torrance. There's about 30,000 miles on the car. It was using oil. I drove it since the 1996 when I restored it. I drove it about 3,000 miles a year to different Volvo events. I've driven it about 4 times to Arizona. Arizona was its first maiden voyage. That was exciting. Caravan with about 6 other Volvos. I was the only one that didn't break down. I drove it up to Clear Lake, California, up to San Rafael, which is, I don't know, 1,300 miles or so. And then many trips down to San Diego and to Anza Borrego Desert to Volvo activities. So it's, people say I'm crazy for driving it, and I say if I can't drive it, I don't want it. Body parts I have to make. Engine parts are still available. Engine, transmission, the 444, early 544, early 122 all had the B16 engine in them. Most of the cars came with a B14. And the B14 engine was a modified B4, which is a very stout tractor engine. They beefed it up, the B14A, they beefed up with twin SU carburetors and a hot cam, developed about 70 horsepower. Then a couple of B16s were installed. Mine was one, it was a test car, and it was ran on a oval track at Volvo in Gothenburg, Sweden, and they put in a B16 after they ran it on this gravel track many times. And there was another car that I think number 66, they put a B16 engine in it. The rest were B14. My car was on the oval track. It was one of the first to go on the oval track. The body was designed by Bill Tritt. When the CEO came here in 1953, he was looking for he was interested in the Corvette that came out in mid-1953, fiberglass, and he wanted a fiberglass sports car. So he went to GM, and GM said Bill Tritt helped him design the Corvette because he already designed his own Glasspar G2 fiberglass car back in 1948, and so they sent him to Bill Tritt in California, and he spent 2 weeks there, and before he left, Bill Tritt drew up the sketches for the car. He immediately dispatched notification to Sweden to develop the frame, which was similar to the 445. That was the only Volvo that had a frame. And they sent that to Bill Tritt along with the drivetrain, the engine, transmission, rear end, and said build the car around it. And that's what he had to do. He was hoping for a wider car and a lower car, but Volvo said build it around what we give you. Mine came to the New York Fair Auto Exposition and was driven across country on a promotional trip, and then ended in Hollywood and got sold. And then I'm the second owner. The rest of the cars were shipped to Los Angeles, Hollywood. They were the only people that could afford them. And there was about 24 cars, I guess, that were shipped there. They were all sold out of Hollywood. They came in 3 colors. There was a light yellow, which they made very few of. They came in light blue. It was kind of a robin blue. And then what they called a light gray, which was sort of like the California Volvo white. It has a little gray in it, a little gray-brown in it. Also, the 240 white is the same color. There was one car that was painted black. That was the one that went to Morocco. That's the only car that was painted black. And then one of the prototypes was painted red. It was later changed the color, but it was in an advertisement. That's how we know it was red. Now, the cars were not painted, except for the black and red. The color was in the gel coat, which is the outer layer. And they just put the paint in the gel coat, so it never was a true color or a bright color. The CEO, then Ingenlau, back in 1957, was given a number 49. All the rest of the 57s came to the U.S. But he was given the number 49, and he drove it for the weekend, and he said, oh my gosh, I thought the doors were going to fall off. It shook so bad. And that was a lot to do with the way Sweden did the hardware on the car. So he canceled the production at 68, although there was parts for 100. They originally wanted to build 300 of them. So he canceled it, and that was the demise of the car.
What happened to those parts?
A lot of them went to a warehouse in San Bernardino, as a matter of fact. And then, after many years, San Bernardino threw them away, including brand new windshields and all kinds of body parts. So that hurt.
What's your favorite thing about this car?
It's unique. It's kind of a kick to drive. It's not the easiest thing to drive. It's definitely not environmentally friendly. It's really hot in the summer and really cold in the winter. It does have a heater, but with the convertible top, it's not, and the top isn't exactly weather-tight either, even brand new. In fact, that was one of the criticisms when they took the first 1,300-mile road test back in 1956. One of the complaints was that the roof leaked. It was Helmer Peterson, the chief engineer, that took it on this road trip, and he went down took it to Morocco and back. And he listed about 29 items that needed to be fixed, and he said it'd be a great car if all these items were taken care of. A number of those items were never taken care of. And the funny thing is, this was between December, and it ended late December and then ended in early January. The first production car that was sold was January 14, 1956. So they took the test run, they sold the car before it was actually test run. And then the second test run, and the first test run, they ran it at 90 miles an hour. They also saw a little girl in the middle of the road, avoided the girl, ran into a tree, crashed the fender, repaired the fender. It was fiberglass, repaired the fender, and continued on the trip. That's one of the advantages of fiberglass. The second trip went down to, that was several months later, went down to South Africa and back. And that was a 2,400-mile trip, and they cruised at 102 miles an hour. So how they did it on the highways back in '57, I don't know, but that's what was in the report. My cruising speed, comfortable cruising speed, is 70 miles an hour. On trips to Arizona, where we had some lead-foot Volvo people, cruised at 85 going to Arizona. Back in '64, I took the car up to Big Bear at a fraternity party, went down the backside to Mojave Desert, and drove the car with 4 people in it over the dunes at 115 miles an hour. They kind of sat in the back. And then I brought the car back up to Big Bear. This was Thanksgiving weekend. It was a week-long fraternity party. The first time in the history it snowed big time in Big Bear. And I had my first time on the job the following Monday, and it started snowing on Thursday. And so I had I had to come home. So it had stopped snowing, but going down the hill, the only thing that saved me was the snow plows pushed up the snowbanks, and I slid all the way down the hill and slid all the way home, and had a great big fur coat on, and the back window was out on the car, and it filled up with snow. When I got back down here and stopped the car, all kinds of snow came down from the fender wells. They were packed, so it was quite an adventure. I can outlast any of the PV cars and the P1800 cars, because they had 10 gallons, and I think the 1800 had a 12-gallon, I think. And I think that's what the 122, about 10. So I was the president of the Volvo Club. I started it, founded the Orange County Volvo Club in 1956, ran it for 10 years and was the editor. And I planned most of the trips. And I would put all the start with the 444s at the very front. And so when they needed gas, that's when we pulled over, because I could always outrun any of them. Well, one of the problems that it has is the same problem the Corvettes had, and that's called spidering. And especially in the places where the body is the stiffest, you would think it would be where it flexed, but it's where it's stiffest, developed these spiders, and they had to be ground out, filled, and then primered, painted over. All the cars now all have been mostly repainted. They would just paint over the gel coat. Volvo was very good. Even with their PV cars, they like to get bearings and engine parts and other parts that were off of other cars, so they didn't have to redesign the wheel, which is very smart, cut down costs considerably. And in this car in particular, the taillights are 50 Chevy taillights. The clutch and brake pedal pads are XK120. Sun visors are early Mercedes. Most of the running gear, steering wheel, etc., hubcaps are all PV444. And the grille is rather unique. It is very similar to the 47 Studebaker Lark, and it's a very classic grille because within the past 5 years, Cadillac used the same similar grille. So it has stood its time. Maintenance is extremely important. I learned that from Irv Gordon, who had 3 million mile 1800, who has passed and was a personal friend of mine. I have gone to several meets and we've had our cars photographed together. Maintenance was his number one thing. Every 3,000 miles there was the engine oil change, and that's how he managed to put 3 million miles on his car. He was a very cool guy. He was a school teacher. He had to, how he got started driving so many miles, he had to drive 160 miles to school every day. And then he started going to a lot of the Volvo meets. He lived in New York, and he did a lot of Volvo trips to Volvo activities in California. So he put on quite a few miles that way. My schedule for maintenance on my car, every 3,000 miles, I change the oil in the filter, and once a year, regardless of if there's no miles on the car or 3,000 miles on the car, I change the oil in the engine, transmission, and rear end, repack the wheel bearings, and lube all the fittings. That's standard no matter how many miles I put on the car. Oil will deteriorate over time. You don't have to put any miles on it. One reason why you want to change it once a year is because on the older cars you get the brass mainly flakes a little bit. In fact, when you drain it, you'll see little tiny flakes. And you want to get that out because it wears the parts. It's like sandpaper. It's had one engine rebuild in 60 years, and it ran great. It just used a little oil, and I felt it was time, and it'd be the last time in my lifetime that it gets rebuilt. And I wanted to drive it for at least another year before I get too old to drive it. At 80, your joints start to freeze up a little bit, and pushing the pedals gets a little harder. It had to be bored out, and the only pistons they could find for it were 60 thousandths over. So that's why it got bored out to 60 thousandths. Esconderi had a cam, and they had the blanks for the cam for this car. And so I got a new cam, didn't upgrade it, but it was a new cam, new valves, and I also had the seats hardened because of the no lead fuel. And of course it had new springs and all bearings and all that kind of stuff, and it was balanced. And then the transmission was gone through, new synchros put in and new seals. I don't know of any dealership that, until my car came along, didn't know about a 1900. Well, the first time I called up, when I first started working on my car, I called up and I said, do you have any parts for a 1900? And they said, sure, come on down. So I go down there and they said, oh, you mistaken. There's no such thing as a 1900. We have parts for an 1800. And I says, no. Take a look outside, there's a P1900. And of course, they didn't have any parts. Now, as far as parts, engine, transmission, rear end are 444, so those parts aren't readily available, but are attainable. The gauges are all VDO, but they're unique in that they're all in Swedish. It has the speedometer, 4-inch speedometer, 4-inch tack, which was originally had a flex cable that went to the back of the generator. And then the gauges, there's an oil temp, an oil pressure, water temperature, ammeter, and they're all in Swedish, and they're in centigrade. And the oil pressure is in bars, and a bar is approximately 14.2 pounds per bar. 5 bars is around 75 pounds, and that's maximum, and that's what it runs at now. It idles about 2 bars, which is about 24 pounds. At the factory it was 70 horsepower, and I'm guessing now with the shaved head, and they did shave the block, the bigger pistons, I'm guessing it's probably around 85 horsepower. I was close friends with Dan Jansson, who was the only executive. He was number 3 man in Volvo in the U.S. He was in charge of communications. And he was a hands-on Volvo person. He actually worked on his own 444 and loved the car, knew about the cars, and went on a crusade to restore 444, 544, 122, and a P1900 that they got from Europe, and restored them all, and they're in the museum in the U.S. And he's now retired, but he was a very good friend of mine, and he also was instrumental in the C70 debut in Arizona. They rented a whole hotel and had about 150 news people from all over the world at that event, and that's where the car, the P1900 from Arizona, the blue one, and my P1900 met and was on display along with the new C70. So it was really cool. The body is 600 pounds. The total weight is 1,950 pounds. So the engine and frame take up most all of the weight.
Is there any other car that you've driven that can compare to how it feels to drive this?
No.
Wow.
No, totally unique, wow. Totally different. And just shifting it the shifting lever was affectionately known as a meter stick because it's about 3 foot long and curved. If it's up in second gear, if you let your foot off the gas, it will shift by itself because of the weight of the knob was aluminum, and it would shift by itself. With the 3-speed, it'd be first, second, third. So second would be up high. On the 4-speed, it was first, second. If it was in third, it would drop down. I have the 4-speed because the 4-speed went with the B16 engine. Now, originally, and in the posters before the car was built, it advertised a German GF 5-speed transmission, which is awesome. But the production of the transmission didn't come in time, and so they only put one of them in one of the cars to test it out. And that was one of the later models because the transmission was available. That transmission was used in the DeLorean, but it would have made all the difference in the world in driving this car or any other Volvo with the German 5-speed.
Any advice to somebody who's young and is thinking about getting into classic Volvos?
Volvos are forever. In my Volvo club, I did have a few younger kids that loved Volvos. And maybe 15 years ago, it was really a big thing for the parents to give their kids the 240 Volvo because it was such a well-built standard car. It was a great car for kids to start off on, and they last a long time. The greatest thing about Volvo is its durability, and it goes back to the very first OV4, which was the Jacob, the first couple, four I guess were called the Jacob, and that was had a soft top touring car. And they started racing it in 1927. And through the years, the 444 and 544 won many a road race, not because of its aerodynamics, but because of its durability. It outlasted all of the cars on like the Newport to Ensenada Enduro race and several of the other Enduro races. They won because they held up. And that started back in 1927 from the very first Volvo. And that's their heritage. That's what they have kind of lost sight of, Volvo. When all the old timers left, the new people just considered it as a new car and forgot about the heritage and how great that heritage is. There's many 1800s on the road today. I have a very good friend that has an 1800 that his dad bought new. He restored it and is driving it today. His name is Casey Moore. There's a number of stories like that. A lot of Volvo friends from around the world. Through the national events, I've met Volvo people from all over the world, and they're all great people with great cars.